All right, so here we are in the after hours, and George is joining us. Great to have you back on here, George. And the first thing I wanted to do, well, first of all, are you having a drink and joining us with a drink? What are you drinking?
I'm having what's called a bitter party of one, which I blatantly stole the recipe from a restaurant in Greensboro, North Carolina. So yeah, it's a mixed cocktail. I'm working with Mount Gay rum, so like a darker rum. There's absinthe, which is a wormwood liqueur with star anise flavor to it. Two different kinds of bitters. The Rizzo, which is primarily grapefruit, peppercorn, a couple other flavors. That's from a North Carolina bitters company. Angostura bitters, which is very clovey, like lots of like great like sort of warm spice to it. What else is in there? Oh yeah, lemon and lime juice, and
Nice.
then some falernum, which is a flavored syrup. Bunch of different stuff
So,
in that.
so George, I have a question for you. I hope this isn't too personal, but are you a millennial?
Oh,
Oh
definitely.
yeah,
Yeah, I
okay,
was
that's
born in
what I thought. I
1989,
assumed
so
that. And do you know how I knew that? Because on your Twitter feed, there's pictures of all your food, which is basically
yeah.
which is basically my test for millennials. That I always ask somebody when I need to know if they're a millennial or not. I ask them point blank, "Do you take pictures of your food?" And if you do, and you post them on Twitter or Instagram, and it's only millennials that do it. Us Gen X's don't do that. I do want to say one thing. While you were telling me about bitter party of one, I googled it and I realized I got the Urban Dictionary one definition. It's
All
not.
right, read it.
It's not bad. It's not like one of those ones where you're like, oh, don't when John Oliver says, oh, you should Google it on the Urban Dictionary, and then you're like upset about it. You feel a little nauseous after reading it. It's not one of those, but it's an individual who sulks in a corner after being caught in an embarrassing moment. Someone who has been served and cries about it. Troy showed up to the party with Meg and his ex-girlfriend. Lisa saw them. Now Lisa's having a bitter party of one. It
Oh,
actually
okay.
sounds
I
like a little
love
bit.
it.
So, George,
Uh,
you're a fellow Canadian. Where are you from?
Born and raised in British Columbia. So I grew up in Nelson, British Columbia, southeast BC. It's sort of between uh, the Rocky Mountains and the Okanagan, kind of equidistant, West Kootenays.
Right.
now,
It's Nelson.
when did you
Wait,
move to
Nelson
the?
has a ski hill, right? Doesn't it?
Yeah, Whitewater is the ski hill I grew up skiing. So it's about 25 minutes from where I lived growing up, 25 minutes from town. So yeah, when I was growing up, it was just two double lifts. They've since done a bit of an expansion, but it was voted at one point in the late 1990s the best snow in the world. It's got a really unique microclimate with awesome, awesome powder. Huge, huge snowfall every year. I mean, we get something like a cumulative 30 plus feet of snow into that valley every year. So it was
That's
a
awesome.
great place to grow up skiing because there was always something new piece of terrain or trees or powder bowls or whatever you wanted to explore and ski on.
Speaking
So
of powder
George,
bowls, isn't it just 1 second, Patrick? I got to go down this road a
yeah.
little bit. Isn't it a bunch of isn't it a bunch of potheads that live in Mount Nelson?
Yeah, so the anecdote I like to illustrate how big pot was the underground economy and really the whole economy of the town I grew up in. When I was a kid, well, when I was growing up or a young man, Rolling Stone wrote two different articles about the pot culture in Nelson. Um, so yeah, I mean, there was like a head shop with a Bob Marley mural as big as the building on it. I think there were at one point two different hydroponics shops in a town of 10,000 people when I was growing up. So yeah, I mean, lot of pot culture for sure. And of all the different subcultures you could have, that's probably not the worst one. Certainly didn't get in the way of Nelson being a really friendly and inviting place, like place where a lot of people go to check out in the summer and get some great mountain views or ski in the winter, and really nice folks. So it definitely wasn't a bad thing, but I do get a kick out of it looking back on it.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I love going cat skiing, and I always go to Revelstoke or somewhere around there, and it's always when people talk about it, the locals always talk about somebody being from Nelson, and they go, "Oh, you're that's the real pothead place," and I think to myself, these are people from Revelstoke saying that the Nelson guys are real potheads. I'm thinking, how bad is Nelson got to be for them to think that's a pothead? Anyways, it's not
well,
only
next
that.
time you go cat skiing, you got to check out Baldface, which is the Nelson operation. I had lots of friends that worked there when I was in high school and college. So Baldface for your next cat skiing expedition out west, in my opinion.
Or your next wanting to go and get stoned for 4 days. Go check it out. So, George, not only are you a proud Canadian, you're also the great-grandson of a very famous Canadian, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so my great-granddad was George R. Pearkes. We share a first and last name. No middle initial, blessedly, is not identical. Otherwise, that would be impossible to find on Google. So yeah, he held a number of positions throughout his life in Canadian military, police, government. At one point, he was the commander-in-chief of Canadian forces in Europe. He was transferred over during the Second World War. He was transferred over before D-Day and before things really ramped up on the continent proper, but to take over West Coast defenses. But he ended up as the Minister of Defense under Diefenbaker. And if people have ever heard of the Avro Arrow, he was the Minister of Defense that canceled that project. So if it weren't for my great-granddad, Canada might have had its own supersonic jet fighter ready to take off and defend the northern flank of the country against the impending menace from the USSR.
You know what's funny, George? I just Googled you and I realized that your grandfather has an icebreaker named after him, which I'm sure you know. So it's not often that we get somebody on the show that has basically has an icebreaker or a boat named after them at all. So have you ever seen it? Have you ever gone and seen the CCGS George R. Pearkes?
I haven't, but when I was growing up, we had a dear family friend who since passed, who was a talented woodworker, and he actually built a model of the George R. Pearkes icebreaker for us to have, for my brother and I to play with, and whatever. And he painted it red and white and the whole bit. So, and it was a great toy boat, floated real well, and was super stable and the whole thing. So I've never seen it in person, but I did have a toy boat.
It's because it's based in Newfoundland, so I don't blame you for not going. It's probably a little cold. Anyways, let's talk.
Bit of a long way to get to from anywhere I've lived recently.
That's correct. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk some markets. Patrick,
well,
did you have a question?
I just got to ask him one question. As a Canadian, have you? I'm drinking the national drink of Canada, the Caesar. I just wanted to know whether you've recently had one and what you think of this drink.
Where you stand on the Caesar?
Well, so I mean, obviously, the Bloody Mary is the American version of the Caesar. For people that aren't familiar, a Caesar. Well, look, I didn't say it was better or as good as a Caesar. I'm just, grounding people in what we're talking about here. So, a Bloody Mary, obviously, you've got tomato juice, you've got vodka, usually vodka, sometimes gin, but usually vodka. You've got horseradish pepper, some sort of hot sauce to spice it up a little bit, and then often a garnish or two, like a piece of celery or pickle or whatever. In Canada, it's the same drink, but instead of tomato juice, it's clamato juice. Now, a lot of Americans won't be familiar with what clamato juice is. It's tomato juice with clam juice, right? Yeah. And that sounds awful, but it actually makes a much better cocktail. So I am a huge fan of the Caesar. I'm there for the Caesar. It is the correct way to do the drink. It's much more interesting. It'll gross people out in a fun way that's a conversation starter. I regularly buy clamato juice to sort of do our own homemade version. It's a little bit of a pain to get it seasoned correctly, but we will do that at home for sure. So yeah, a big fan of the Caesar. It's a great drink. I'm not sure I would classify it as Canada's national drink. I mean, it is delicious though, and my buddies and I had a great gag a while back. My Canadian buddies on WhatsApp, we would always send each other pictures of Caesars that had extreme garnishes. So you'll sometimes see restaurants that will do like as a gag sort of special dish or whatever, special drink to get attention, a Caesar that's got like a mini piece of pizza and a mini hamburger and 3 shrimp and an oyster and 4 different kinds of vegetables all stuffed into this just mound of stuff on top of your on ice cocktail. So the Caesar's a great drink. It's definitely a Canadian tradition, and I salute your Caesar choice. Well done.
Oh, absolutely. I was saying earlier that the key, and I picked this up from this place out here in St. Catharines that started doing it, is you got to put a little pickle juice inside the Caesar. It actually is pretty epic. Anyway, I'm enjoying one right now. I had to smuggle, because I'm down in Florida when we're recording this, and I had to smuggle my own Clamato down here in order to be able to enjoy some Caesars down here.
Well, one last.
You couldn't get it in Publix or whatever?
Sorry?
You couldn't go to Publix and get Clamato? Because you can get Clamato at Harris Teeter here.
Oh, really? I've been looking down in Florida. I can't.
You smuggled it for no reason at all, Patrick. You didn't need to. One last drink question before we get on to the markets. So one of my favorite beers of all time is Granville Pale Ale, which heralds out of the great city of Vancouver. Were you a fan? Did you grow up drinking that, George?
Just before I answer this question, I apologize. I've got 2 dogs who tend to go nuts when anyone knocks at the door, so I've got them in my office. The consequence of that is that they've gotten a little rambunctious and have been wrestling, so I really apologize to anyone listening to this. If you hear them in the background, it's just my 2 puppies tearing each other apart. I'm really sorry.
No worries.
Couldn't be calmer. As far as Granville Island Brewing Company, good beer. We had Nelson Brewing Company when I was growing up. So, long before there were brewing companies in every town scattered across North America, often more like 2 or 4 or 6 in every small town. We had Nelson Brewing Company. We had our own coffee company as well, Oso Negro, which is great coffee if you happen to see it somewhere. But Nelson Brewing Company had, sorry.
No worries. No worries.
Nelson Brewing Company was what we used to drink when I would go back when I was very late in high school, or when I would go back for college break when I was in college. And then Kokanee is the other thing that would get a lot of attention, because that brewery is down the road in Creston. Kokanee is sort of a more mass market beer. The way I like to explain it to Americans is Coors Light, but for Canada.
Yeah, I was going to say Kokanee, like bragging that it's from your neck of the woods is not a good thing.
Kokanee's great. I will put Kokanee up against your Molsons any day of the week. And Labatt, come on now.
Oh, yeah.
Come on
This
now.
is an East versus West thing, and you know what? As a Winnipegger, I'm kind of in between. But so you didn't grow up drinking Granville. You basically think your Nelson Brewery is better. But what do you think of the Granville today?
I haven't had Granville brews in forever, so I couldn't give a fair assessment. But if you're ever in Vancouver, the Granville Island market is fantastic. It's a must visit. It's super cool. You can take a water taxi to this awesome indoor market with all kinds of food and specialty, like, butchers or flower shops or anything you can imagine, really. It's millennial paradise. You'll be able to Instagram all kinds of stuff from there, and it's really great. So if you're ever in Vancouver, go to Granville Island. You can check out the brewing company too, but Granville Island's market is definitely a can't miss.
Okay, so let's talk some markets.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask the question, George.
Okay, you go ahead.
I'm going to ask this one because I really want to translate. So, I mean, we talked all sorts of things like steepeners and other types of trades to put on. But for our listeners, like if you had one trade to recommend to our listeners that's like an idea that you have that you think would be a great theme to put on, what kind of a trade would you recommend?
So one thing I have been early on and been pretty wrong about so far, but mea culpa, has been European automakers. And so the reason for this is that there's been a really, really negative sentiment around the sector related to how people think about the cyclical backdrop for autos in Europe specifically, and generally their exposure to the rest of the world, which is dominated by China. The thesis basically is that Chinese auto sales aren't going to continue dropping for very much longer, right? Like they vastly undersell autos relative to what they're capable of given their population and income level. And the recent downtick is going to bottom out. And when that happens, all sorts of good things are going to happen for these very traditional manufacturing businesses that have high fixed cost and that really get a lot of operating leverage when things tend to turn around, just as operating leverage has hurt them on the downside since roughly the end of 2017. So that's a sector I really like. They've got a bunch of US ADRs across the different manufacturers and parts names in Europe. And it's an interesting way to get sort of asymmetric exposure. very, very high risk. I would be the first person to say, very high risk trade to put on. And because, these names move or not, Renault was down 11% today because they guided down towards the end of the year. And what looks like, hopefully, is the kitchen sink guide for that company. They've also had a whole bunch of drama around the tie-up with Nissan. That's just been a massive pain for someone like me who doesn't really care about the corporate finance aspects. Sorry, 1 second.
It's okay. I'm going to jump in here, Patrick. You know what? That's probably almost as crazy a call as
our bank
as like you buying European banks.
Sorry, guys. I just had to kick them out.
No worries. So George, I was laughing. I was saying that is my kind of call. That is got to be one of the gutsier, most unloved trades that I've ever heard of. And I'm going to go and do some work on it this weekend.
So George,
because that's my kind of that's kind of my contrarian call.
So we have a bet between Kevin and I for Deutsche Bank first touch, $10 or $5 for the US dollar price. Whose side do you take?
Can you guys pull up the chart, because I don't even know where DB's been trading recently.
It's about $7.92 right now. I think when we did it, it was right at $7.50. And there was all the rules of the world that think it's all going to negative. It's going to be zero because and rightfully so. He's been bearish.
Kev's level, and here's my level.
I'll take Kev's level. I'm going to side with Kev on this one.
Ah, there we go. George is my kind of guy. See, it's us Westerners. It's stick together, Patrick.
So I will say, like the thing with Deutsche Bank is, and this is a confusion I think that was very significant when these European banks and Deutsche Bank specifically were making new lows earlier this year, and people were flipping out about it and how it's the end of the world and they're going to fall to all-time lows and go to zero and all this stuff. There's a big difference between solvency issues with banks and profitability issues with banks. There are very few solvency issues with banks anywhere in the developed world right now. The U.S. is by far the cleanest dirty shirt, and it's not dirty at all. The cleanest shirt in the room. Australian and Canadian banks, maybe not quite as clean if the real estate markets really continue to suffer there. But European banks have a massive profitability problem, right? They've got huge cost of capital. They don't make very much on their lending. Lending growth has been growing at a decent clip in Europe, but they haven't been able to generate really high returns on equity, or the kind of returns on equity that you would need to sustain higher valuations. So, there's a huge difference between what happened in 2007, 2008, where you had massive solvency issues, and that was also true in 2010, 2011 as well. You had solvency issues, but you didn't, the profitability wasn't what people were worried about. They were worried about whether the bank has, more liabilities than they have assets. Now, nobody's really concerned about the amount of equity that European banks have. There is no reason to suspect the entire sector is going to go bankrupt on a solvency basis. The issue is they don't make any money, right? They don't make anywhere near as much money as they should. They've got very low returns on assets, very low returns on equity relative to history. They're still probably cheap relative to that, but if you can't get that moving in the right direction, why own the stocks? And that's the problem, as opposed to they have huge liabilities and not enough assets to cover them, and that's a problem. So that's my spiel on European banks.
Right.
Okay, just on signing off, George, why don't you give us one more trade? I love the idea about looking at German automakers. Why don't you give us one more that people might want to have a look at? What are some of the other things that really intrigue you?
Or even just a broad market call. Do you think the market's going higher or lower here? What's your take on the S&P?
So I just real quick, to throw some numbers at people. I looked today at what the S&P says analysts think about the outlook for operating earnings going out to the end of 2020. So if you assume that the analysts are right, that's obviously a big leap to get to, and prices don't change, then the multiple at the end of next year, so the end of 2020, will be 15.6 times. If you assume that operating earnings are 5% too optimistic in each quarter, and the market actually goes up 10% per quarter, or 10% annualized over the next 15 months here, basically, you will see a December Q4 2020 multiple of 18.5 times. So the point there is not to say that U.S. stocks are insanely cheap, but barring some sort of large disappointment on earnings over the next year or so, it looks like the U.S. market is pretty attractively valued when you consider that the peak for multiples in terms of operating earnings for the S&P was 22.2 times at the end of 2015.
Right.
Currently we're at 18.4 times, I believe is the number, and we've been as low as 17.6 in the last couple of years. So it's really hard to look at the U.S. equity market right now and say that's overvalued, that's ridiculously aggressive. And if you're going to say that it's not overvalued, then forward returns roughly in line or maybe slightly below, but generally, in line with the long-term averages start to look like they make a lot more sense. And saying, oh, well, I can expect equities to go up roughly 10% when the markets move sideways for 18 months. And we've sort of been digesting some big gains from 2017 makes a lot of sense. And I think that is relatively out of consensus if you think about the concerns right now over earnings for Q4, if you think about how the market's thinking about the risk of recession, if you think about how the market's thinking about global trade headwinds or risk related to the election in the US in 2020 or whatever reason you have to not buy stocks here, valuations don't look very dramatic. And if you think that's true, then you probably think owning US stocks with an eye towards what should be pretty standard historical returns makes sense, and therefore you should be at least relatively exposed to U.S. equities, and probably, because they tend to move together, global equities as well.
Do you? So what's your over/under in terms of is the market overestimating the probability of a recession here? Do you think that there's a better chance than not that we don't see one here, or do you think that that this is something something that inevitably will happen here?
What I would say about recession risk is that the U.S. equity market is not pricing a huge amount of recession risk. There's certainly some recession risk pricing in specific stocks or sectors or, relative to long-term returns, but it's hard to look at U.S. equities where they are right now around 3,000 and say, oh, well, that's obviously super, super bearish about, the outlook for the U.S. economy. Interest rate markets are another story, but as I talked about earlier, that bull flattening as opposed to bear flattening of the U.S. yield curve makes things look really different relative to prior pre-recession periods. And so, where I come down on recession risk is that recession risk is much lower than the consensus is, which has been true for roughly 10 years now, right? We've seen since 2009 constant drumbeats of negativity, constant drumbeats of high risk of a double dip recession or a recession that's kicked off by what's going on in Europe or emerging markets or the dollar or oil or whatever is going to be the next big pain trade. And as a result, the investors have consistently overestimated recession risk. And I think that's, as long as that's true, recession risk is lower than people tend to think it is. So for me, recession risk right now, as of today, is certainly elevated relative to where it's been over the past 10 years, but it's not particularly high. And it's especially not particularly high if you look at data as opposed to what fixed income markets are saying in terms of the shape of the curve or, not controlling for the fact that it's been a bull flattening as opposed to a bear flattening.
All right. Well, George, listen, I can't thank you enough for giving us an hour of your time to kind of take a deep dive into the macro markets here. But before we let you go, why don't you just one more time let our listeners know where they can find you and follow you, and even a little bit about your podcast that people can listen to after they finish their weekly market huddle.
Absolutely. So my name is George Pearkes. I am the macro strategist for Bespoke Investment Group. You can follow me on Twitter at Pearkes, Pearkes. You can follow Bespoke on Twitter at Bespoke Invest. BespokePremium.com is our website, which you should check out for our blog or for a trial of what we put out every week. You can also check out our podcast, which is totally free. We call it Bespokecast. It's not weekly like you guys' segments are, which I'm envious you're able to put out a podcast every week. I'm not capable of doing that. So we have irregular podcast, but there's a large back library with a whole bunch of different kinds of investors and market commentators and folks that have interesting things to say. So you should definitely check that out as well. And guys, thanks for having me on. It's been great to talk to some fellow Canadians and talk drinks and talk markets. And let's do this again sometime.
Oh, absolutely. Well, George, thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.